First and foremost, industrialists employed the cheapest labour they could because it was the most profitable. Children and women were seen as easier to control than men, not to mention their relatively cheap cost. It was, after all, totally legal as the governments of the day tried not to interfere, a belief known as laissez-faire or let it be. People continued to accept the jobs because, quite simply, they needed the money to survive. There was no other option. There were lots of people competing for the jobs, so they had no choice. If conditions in factories were bad, then conditions for workers in mines were way worse. Here, as in factories, children were seen as valuable employees, as you can see in this photograph. Factory hazard seems pretty much mild compared to the risk taken by mining labourers. Cave-ins, drownings, explosions all contributed to this risk. Despite all of this, higher than average wages in mines continued to draw workers. Underground conditions were generally quite lethal. Darkness, coal dust, explosive gases and incredible heat gave the impression of basically a hell on earth. In the illustration above, we can see a glimpse into two of the horrible jobs that were on offer in the mines. The job on the left is, believe it or not, a safety mechanism. This job's name was the trapper, and their position simply involved them opening and closing doors which were designed to prevent gas explosions from engulfing the whole mine. They were expected to sit underground for periods of up to 16 hours, simply opening and closing a door. The putter, whose job was to haul or push coal carts to the top. Here, as with the factories, the children's size was crucial. This quote from the 1840s describes the debilitating work undertaken by many of these children. Agnes Kerr, 15, was 9 years old when she commenced carrying coal. Makes 18 to 20 journeys a day. A journey is about 400 metres. Has to ascend many ladders. Can carry about 75 kilos. This was a 9-year-old girl, 15 at the time she was reporting, carrying 75 kilos. It's quite incredible. One little aside, you may have heard a famous quote, which is a canary in a coal mine. This actually derives from these early mines where toxic gases like methane would build up from the coal. They were lethal and explosive, and if a miner lit a candle or anything, it would explode. So miners tried to predict when the gases were building up by bringing down canaries in cages. Canaries, which were quickly killed in the presence of large concentrations of gas, allowed miners to, hopefully, avoid the same fate. So this is why we still use the term a canary in a coal mine for something that is helping us to predict the future. Despite precautions such as these, mining was an incredibly dangerous occupation, which saw huge mortality rates, such as the people above, which were the victims of a cave-in. Fortunately, Conservatives in government were, over time in England, gradually persuaded by more reform-minded colleagues to make changes. These often took decades to achieve and wouldn't have created luxurious conditions by any means, but they did serve to improve the basic conditions of workers. Let's look at some of these reforms. Whilst reform was made up of many hundreds of acts of parliament, those shown on this page represent some of the most significant changes that occurred during the period. First, we had the 1819 Factory Act. You can see the conditions of this here. This forbade employment for under 9s. It basically ensured that for 9 to 16-year-olds, they could only work 72 hours. There was 1.5 hours for meals, but this was only initially for cotton mills. So they had to pass another act. This was known as the 1833 Althorp's Factory Act. This one was, again, forbid people under 9 being employed, and it sets strict hours for 9s to 13s at 42 hours per week, 69 for 13 to 16s. Children and young adults couldn't do night work. There was no cleaning of machines that were in use, which seems straightforward, but they hadn't thought of that before, and there were inspectors to make sure that this would take place. In 1843, they extended a little bit further from just factories to the Mines and Collieries, which is a coal mine, Act. No women or children under 10 were allowed, no women, no children under 10 were allowed to work in mines or collieries. There were no under 15s on the winding gear, which was the heavy equipment which allowed them to bring coal up or down, and there were inspectors put into place here as well. In 1844, they introduced another act called the Graham's Factory Act. This one sort of went a little bit differently and said you couldn't employ anyone under 8, which shows that obviously some of those early acts were being pretty much ignored. They set, again, hours, 6.5 hours for 8 to 13s, 12 hours for the women and under 13s in a particular day, and all dangerous machinery was to be fenced. In 1847, they passed an act called the Fielden's Factory Act, where this set a maximum of 10-hour day for under 18s and women. This is a big step forward. In 1874, a really major act was passed called the Factories and Workshop Act. This actually said that nobody could work more than 56.5 hours per week. Now, this should be compared with now when we work a 40-hour week at most for most people. It was set that you really couldn't work more than 10 hours for Monday to Friday, and Saturdays were set at 6.5 hours. Reform wasn't met, though, with joy by many industrialists or many of the wealthier classes. Criticisms of these changes, due to the limits they placed on profits, were widespread, as can be seen in these 3 quotes from the 1830s. The first one, from Robert Hyde Gregg, an industrialist, says, "Our only advantage are in cheap machinery and low rates of interest. By restricting mills, we give up these advantages and hand them over to the enemy." By the enemy, they usually mean the French or the Germans. Nassau Senior, an economist of 1837, said, "In a mill, the whole net profit is derived from work provided in the last hours of the day. If the hours of work were reduced by 1 hour per day, the whole profit would be destroyed." It's not actually true, but that's what he believed. In 1833, the Leeds Mercury newspaper said, "The 1833 Factory Act is dictated by the best of intentions, but it is a crude piece of legislation calculated to harass the manufacturers by minute interference, while it secures for children more leisure and less wages than their parents will approve." So you can see it's making a logical point. It's like, even though people really didn't want their kids working, a lot of them seem to have no choice. The ideas of the previous slide illustrate the concept known as capitalism, a belief which underpins our economic and social system to a large extent today. We'll just pause for a brief moment to explain what capitalism is. Capitalism is based on 3 main principles, namely that it's important to have privately owned enterprise rather than governments owning enterprise. The second one is that the goal is profit and the recreation of capital, that is, money that's able to be used for reinvestment. The third one is the encouragement of competition and self-sufficiency in people, with little interference from governments. The lives of tens of thousands of people during the Industrial Revolution had absolutely been improved because of this belief, but they were mainly people from the middle class and the industrialist groups who had become much richer. For the majority of people, you can see the conditions had actually suffered because the idea had been taken too far. So the general idea at this time was that some balance needed to be struck. This balance would only be possible because of the political and social activism by many hundreds of well-meaning individuals. Progressives, like Robert Owen, who we'll hear more about soon, Lord Shaftesbury, who was a very wealthy MP and reformer who championed the rights of the poor, and Elizabeth Gaskell, a famous writer of the time and novelist who published stories telling the lives of poor people, all contributed to the type of change which occurred during this time. People like this wanted to see improvement made for society as a whole and were willing to work towards achieving this, even though they were actually working for people who were quite out of their social class. People like Lord Shaftesbury